He moves in next door with a huge dog. What happens next to the elderly widow and her cat? Eleanor Ainsworth adjusted the lace curtains of her living room window, her gaze settling on the vibrant red maple tree that dominated her small front yard. It was autumn in Havenwood, Pennsylvania, a town that embraced the changing seasons with an almost theatrical flair. The leaves were at their peak, a riot of crimson, gold, and russet, a stark contrast to the quiet, almost somber, rhythm of Eleanor's life. At 82, her days were measured not by grand events, but by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the soft purr of her ginger cat, Rusty, and the ritual of her afternoon tea. Rusty, a creature of habit and comfort, was currently curled in a sunbeam on the worn armchair, his fur the color of a well-brewed cup of Earl Grey. He was, in Eleanor's opinion, the most dignified cat in existence. He rarely deigned to chase mice, preferring to observe the world with a regal air, his amber eyes half closed in perpetual judgment. He was her constant companion, a warm, furry presence that filled the silence of her days since her husband, George, had passed away 5 years prior. The tranquility of Eleanor's afternoon was shattered by the sound of a moving truck rumbling to a stop next door. The house had been empty for months, a for sale sign slowly weathering in the front yard. Eleanor, a creature of habit like her feline companion, was not fond of change. She'd lived in Havenwood her entire life, and the familiar faces and routines were a comfort. A new neighbor meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was something Eleanor avoided at all costs. She peered through the curtains, watching as a man emerged from the truck. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a rugged build and a weary expression. He wore a faded denim jacket and jeans, his dark hair tousled by the wind. He didn't look like he belonged in Havenwood, a town that prided itself on its neatly manicured lawns and friendly, if somewhat nosy, residents. Then she saw the dog. A large German shepherd bounded out of the truck, its tail wagging with an enthusiasm that seemed to vibrate through the air. The dog, a magnificent creature with a thick, black and tan coat, immediately began to explore its new surroundings, sniffing at the base of the maple tree and marking its territory with an air of authority. Rusty, disturbed from his nap, rose from the armchair, his fur bristling. He let out a low hiss, his amber eyes narrowed into slits as he stared at the canine intruder. The German shepherd, catching sight of the cat, stopped its exploration and let out a deep bark, the sound echoing through the quiet street. "Max, quiet!" the man called out, his voice firm but not unkind. He attached a leash to the dog's collar and pulled him back towards the house. "Sorry about that," he said, offering Eleanor a sheepish smile. "He's just excited." Eleanor offered a tight, polite smile in return. "It's quite all right," she said, her voice a little shaky. She wasn't used to dealing with large, boisterous dogs. Or new neighbors, for that matter. The man introduced himself as Daniel Carter. He explained that he'd recently moved from Philadelphia, seeking a quieter life after some life changes. He didn't elaborate, and Eleanor didn't pry. She was a private person herself, and she respected the privacy of others. Over the next few days, the initial tension between Rusty and Max showed no signs of abating. Every time Eleanor let Rusty out into the backyard, Max would be there, patrolling the fence line, barking and growling. Rusty, in turn, would arch his back, hiss, and retreat to the safety of the porch. Eleanor found herself constantly on edge, worried about a potential confrontation between the two animals. Daniel, to his credit, tried his best to keep Max under control. He installed a higher fence between the two properties, a gesture that Eleanor appreciated, even if it didn't completely solve the problem. She could sense that Daniel was a good man, albeit a troubled one. There was a sadness in his eyes, a weariness that mirrored her own. She too was carrying burdens. Her fixed income barely covered her expenses, and the old house was in constant need of repairs. The roof leaked, the plumbing was temperamental, and the heating system was on its last legs. She worried about the upcoming winter, about the cost of heating oil, and about the possibility of something major breaking down. She missed George terribly, not just for his companionship, but for his practical skills. He had always been the one to handle the house repairs, the finances, the things that now felt overwhelming. One chilly evening, as Eleanor was preparing a simple dinner of soup and toast, she heard a knock at her door. It was Daniel, his face etched with concern. "Mrs. Ainsworth," he said, his voice hesitant. I think Max got out. I can't find him anywhere." Eleanor's heart sank. She knew that Rusty was in the backyard, enjoying his evening stroll. She pictured the two animals face to face with no one to intervene. "Oh dear," she said, her voice trembling. "Rusty's out back." Together, they rushed into the backyard, calling out for their respective pets. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the autumn wind and the distant hum of traffic. The fear was a cold knot in Eleanor's stomach. She couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to Rusty. He was all she had left. The search for Max and Rusty continued into the night, the beam of Daniel's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Eleanor, despite her age and a growing ache in her knees, insisted on joining him. They called out, their voices hoarse with worry, but there was no sign of either animal. Finally, exhausted and disheartened, they returned to their respective homes. Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, wrapped in a shawl, staring out into the darkness. She imagined Rusty, lost and scared, facing the cold night alone. The thought brought tears to her eyes. The next morning, there was still no sign of the animals. Daniel came over, his face drawn and pale. He'd been up all night, driving around the neighborhood, searching. He apologized profusely, blaming himself for Max's escape. "It's my fault," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have been more careful. I've been distracted lately." Eleanor, seeing his distress, felt a pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to be burdened by worries. She decided to share a little of her own. "We all have our troubles, Daniel," she said softly. "I've been worried about the winter, about the cost of heating. And this old house. It's always needing something fixed." Daniel listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. When she finished, he looked up, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I lost my job a few months ago," he confessed. That's part of why I moved here. I needed a fresh start, but it's been harder than I thought." He explained that he'd been a software engineer in Philadelphia, working for a large tech company. He'd been laid off during a round of downsizing, a victim of corporate restructuring. The job loss, coupled with a recent divorce, had left him feeling adrift and lost. Eleanor nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. The loss of George had left a similar void in her life, a sense of being unmoored. "It's like the rug's been pulled out from under you," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "Exactly," Daniel agreed. "And Max, he's been my only constant through all of this. He's the reason I get out of bed in the morning." The shared vulnerability created a fragile bond between them. They were two strangers, brought together by circumstance, united by their shared worries and their love for their pets. As the day wore on, the hope of finding Rusty and Max dwindled. Eleanor made posters, offering a reward, and Daniel helped her distribute them around the neighborhood. They walked the streets together, calling out their pets' names, their voices growing weaker with each passing hour. Meanwhile, miles away, Rusty and Max were experiencing their own adventure. After their initial confrontation, which had ended in a stalemate rather than a fight, they had found themselves lost in a wooded area on the outskirts of town. Max, with his superior sense of smell, had initially tried to lead them back, but they had become disoriented. The animosity between them began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect. They were, after all, in the same predicament. They huddled together for warmth as the temperature dropped, sharing the meager scraps of food that Max had managed to scavenge. Rusty, surprisingly, even allowed Max to lick a wound he'd sustained during their initial scuffle. Back in Havenwood, Eleanor and Daniel were reaching their breaking points. Eleanor, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion, collapsed in her armchair, tears streaming down her face. Daniel, seeing her distress, felt a surge of helplessness. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. He sat down beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder, hesitant to touch her. He felt a connection to this woman, a shared sense of loss and loneliness. He knew he needed to be strong, for both of them. "We won't give up," he said, his voice firm despite his own despair. "We'll find them." His words, though simple, offered a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, and managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, "for everything." The turning point came unexpectedly. Late that afternoon, a young boy, riding his bike through the woods, spotted two animals huddled together near a creek. He recognized them from the posters he'd seen around town. He rushed home and told his parents, who immediately called Eleanor. Eleanor and Daniel raced to the location, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. When they arrived, they saw them, Rusty and Max, lying side by side, exhausted but alive. The reunion was emotional. Eleanor scooped Rusty into her arms, burying her face in his fur, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Daniel knelt down and hugged Max tightly, his voice choked with emotion. The animals, sensing the relief of their owners, seemed to relax. Max licked Daniel's face, and Rusty, for the first time, purred softly in Eleanor's arms. As they walked back towards town, a strange thing happened. Max, instead of barking at Rusty, walked calmly beside him. Rusty, in turn, didn't hiss or arch his back. They seemed to have reached an understanding, a truce born of their shared ordeal. The shared crisis had forged a bond not only between the animals but also between Eleanor and Daniel. They had faced their fears together, supported each other through their darkest hours, and emerged stronger on the other side. But the crisis wasn't over. A few days later, as a fierce autumn storm raged outside, Eleanor woke up in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in her chest. She felt dizzy and disoriented, her heart racing uncontrollably. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that something was terribly wrong. She managed to reach the phone and dial Daniel's number, her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel, help. I think I'm having a heart attack." Daniel, jolted awake by the urgent call, didn't hesitate. He raced next door, Max at his heels, and found Eleanor slumped on the floor, clutching her chest. He called 911 and stayed with her, talking to her soothingly, trying to keep her calm until the ambulance arrived. Max, sensing the distress, whined softly and nudged Eleanor's hand with his nose, as if offering comfort. Rusty, too, seemed concerned, circling Eleanor and rubbing against her legs. The paramedics arrived quickly and rushed Eleanor to the hospital. Daniel followed in his car, Max riding shotgun, his head resting on Daniel's lap. The waiting room was a blur of anxious faces and hushed conversations. Daniel paced restlessly, his phone clutched in his hand, waiting for news. Hours later, a doctor finally emerged, his expression grim. "Mrs. Ainsworth has suffered a mild heart attack," he said. "We've stabilized her, but she'll need to stay in the hospital for observation. She's lucky you got her here so quickly." Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. He'd been terrified of losing Eleanor, of losing the one person who had shown him kindness and understanding in this new, unfamiliar town. He visited Eleanor every day, bringing her flowers and books, and updates on Rusty. Max, surprisingly, was allowed to visit as well, under Daniel's strict supervision. The nurses were charmed by the gentle giant, and Eleanor's face lit up every time she saw him. The shared experience of the heart attack deepened the bond between Eleanor and Daniel. They were no longer just neighbors. They were friends, confidants, almost family. And as they grew closer, so did their pets. Eleanor's recovery was slow but steady. She returned home after a week in the hospital, weaker but grateful to be back in her own surroundings. Daniel was a constant presence, helping her with groceries, cooking meals and keeping her company. He even took on the task of fixing some of the minor repairs around her house, his newfound purpose giving him a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in months. Rusty and Max, mirroring their owner's growing closeness, began to spend more time together. At first, their interactions were tentative, marked by cautious sniffs and wary glances. But gradually, they began to relax in each other's presence. They would lie in the sun together, groom each other occasionally, and even play, a clumsy, gentle kind of play that was a far cry from their initial hostility. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor and Daniel were sitting on Eleanor's porch, watching the animals play in the yard. Max was chasing a ball, his tail wagging furiously, while Rusty stalked him from the bushes, pretending to hunt. "They're like an old married couple," Eleanor said, a smile playing on her lips. "Always bickering, but secretly devoted to each other." Daniel chuckled. "They've come a long way," he said. "Just like us." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a warmth that went beyond mere friendship. He'd grown to care for her deeply, admiring her resilience, her kindness, and her quiet strength. "Eleanor," he began, his voice hesitant, I don't know what I would have done without you these past few months. You've given me a reason to get out of bed in the morning." Eleanor blushed, her cheeks turning a delicate shade of pink. She too had developed strong feelings for Daniel. He had filled a void in her life, a void that she hadn't realized was so vast until he'd arrived. "You've done the same for me, Daniel," she said softly. "You and Max, and even Rusty in his own grumpy way. You've all become my family." The conversation shifted to more practical matters. Daniel had been actively searching for a job, and he'd finally received an offer from a small tech company in a nearby town. It wasn't as prestigious as his previous job, but it was a stable position with good benefits, and it would allow him to stay in Havenwood. Eleanor was overjoyed for him, but a part of her felt a pang of sadness. She knew that once he started working, he wouldn't have as much time to spend with her. "I'll miss you," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. "I'll miss you too, Eleanor," Daniel replied. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be right next door, and I'll still be here to help you with anything you need." He meant it. He'd found a home in Havenwood, a sense of belonging that he'd been searching for, and Eleanor was a big part of that. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between Eleanor and Daniel, and remarkably between Rusty and Max, solidified. The fence that Daniel had initially erected higher seemed almost superfluous now. Rusty would often be found sunning himself on Daniel's porch steps, and Max would occasionally wander into Eleanor's meticulously kept garden, sniffing at the roses, much to Eleanor's initial dismay, though she eventually softened. He never dug, though. It was as if he understood the sacredness of Eleanor's space. One crisp autumn evening, almost a year to the day since Daniel had arrived, they found themselves sharing a pot of Eleanor's famous apple crisp on her porch. The air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and fallen leaves, a nostalgic aroma that always brought Eleanor back to memories of George. "You know, Daniel," Eleanor began, her voice a little wistful, "George would have liked you. He always appreciated a man who could handle a hammer and wasn't afraid of a little hard work." Daniel smiled, touched by the comparison. "I wish I could have met him. You talk about him with such love." "He was a good man," Eleanor said, her gaze drifting towards the maple tree, now bare of leaves, its branches stark against the twilight sky. "We had our struggles, like everyone, but we had a good life. A simple life, but a good one." "Simple isn't always easy," Daniel observed, thinking of his own complicated past. The divorce had been messy, the financial repercussions significant. He still carried the weight of those experiences, but it was lighter now, shared somehow with Eleanor. "No, it isn't," Eleanor agreed. "But it can be beautiful." They fell silent for a while, listening to the chirping of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Max, curled at Daniel's feet, let out a contented sigh. Rusty, perched on the porch railing, was meticulously grooming his tail, seemingly oblivious to the human's conversation, but Eleanor knew he was listening. He always listened. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, breaking the silence, "about maybe staying in Havenwood permanently. I like the job, and, well, I like it here." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She'd secretly hoped he would say that, but she hadn't dared to voice it. "I'm glad to hear that, Daniel," she said, her voice a little shaky. I would like that very much." He reached across the small table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gently enveloping her frail ones. Her skin was thin and papery, the veins prominent, but his touch was warm and reassuring. "Eleanor," he said, his voice earnest, "I know I'm not George, and I wouldn't try to be, but I care about you a great deal, and I want to be here for you, if you'll have me." Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude and a quiet, unexpected joy. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, "I would like that very much." Their relationship didn't change dramatically after that conversation. They didn't rush into anything. They were, after all, two cautious souls, scarred by past experiences. But there was a new tenderness between them, a deeper understanding. They were companions, friends, and something more, something that defied easy definition. They were two lonely people who had found solace and connection in the most unexpected of places. The animals, too, seemed to sense the shift. Rusty, who had always been fiercely independent, started to seek out Max's company more often. They would often be found curled up together on the rug in front of Eleanor's fireplace. A ginger cat and a German shepherd, an unlikely pair, united by the invisible bonds of love and loyalty that connected their human companions. The next few years passed in a gentle rhythm of shared meals, quiet evenings on the porch, and companionable walks in the park. Daniel continued to work at the tech company, and Eleanor continued to tend her garden and her home, with Daniel's help. They celebrated holidays together, birthdays and anniversaries, marking the passage of time not with grand gestures, but with small, meaningful moments. Rusty and Max, aging gracefully, became inseparable. They were a familiar sight in Havenwood, the ginger cat and the German shepherd, walking side by side, their unlikely friendship a testament to the enduring power of connection. But time, as it always does, marched on. Eleanor's health began to decline. The mild heart attack had been a warning sign, and despite her best efforts, her strength gradually waned. She became more reliant on Daniel, who cared for her with unwavering devotion. He hired a home health aide to help with the more demanding tasks, but he was always there, her constant companion, her anchor. One spring morning, Eleanor woke up feeling particularly weak. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their delicate pink petals drifting down like snow, but she didn't have the energy to go outside and admire them. She lay in bed, listening to the birds singing, feeling a sense of peace, but also a profound sadness. She knew her time was near. Daniel came in, his face etched with concern. He'd seen this coming, but he wasn't ready. He never would be. "How are you feeling, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Tired, Daniel," she whispered, "but peaceful." She reached for his hand, and he held it tightly. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice weak but clear, "for everything. You've given me more happiness these past few years than I ever thought possible." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't speak. "I want you to be happy, Daniel," she continued. "After I'm gone, I want you to find love again, and take care of Max. And Rusty, if he'll let you." Daniel nodded, his throat choked with emotion. "I will, Eleanor," he managed to say. "I promise." She smiled, a faint, beautiful smile that lit up her face. "I love you, Daniel," she whispered. "I love you too, Eleanor," he replied, his voice breaking. She closed her eyes, her breathing becoming shallow. Max, sensing the change, whined softly and nudged her hand with his nose. Rusty, who had been sitting on the windowsill, jumped down and curled up beside her on the bed, purring softly. Eleanor Ainsworth passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the love of her chosen family. The funeral was small and quiet, attended by a few close neighbors and friends. Daniel delivered the eulogy, his voice trembling with emotion as he spoke of Eleanor's kindness, her resilience, and her unwavering spirit. He talked about her love for her garden, her cat, and her late husband, George. And he talked about the unexpected friendship that had blossomed between them, a friendship that had transformed both of their lives. After the funeral, Daniel returned to Eleanor's house, now his house. It felt empty without her, the silence deafening. Max followed him from room to room, his tail drooping, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored Daniel's own. Rusty was nowhere to be found. Daniel sat down in Eleanor's armchair, the one where Rusty used to nap, and closed his eyes. He felt a wave of grief wash over him, so intense that it took his breath away. He had lost his parents, his marriage, and his job, but this loss, the loss of Eleanor, felt different. It was the loss of a friend, a companion, a soulmate. He knew he would survive. He was a survivor, but he also knew that a part of him would always be missing, a part that Eleanor had filled. He opened his eyes and looked around the room. The grandfather clock ticked steadily. The curtains swayed gently in the breeze. The sunbeams danced on the floor. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. He got up and went outside, calling for Rusty. He found him in the backyard, sitting under the maple tree, staring up at the branches. Daniel sat down beside him, and the cat, surprisingly, didn't run away. He leaned against Daniel, his warm fur a small comfort in the vast emptiness. Daniel looked up at the sky, the same sky that Eleanor had looked at so many times. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of acceptance. He knew that Eleanor was gone, but her memory would live on, in the garden she had loved, in the animals she had cherished, and in his heart. He would keep his promise. He would take care of Max, and he would try to befriend Rusty. He would find a way to move forward, to build a new life, a life that honored Eleanor's memory. He would find happiness again, not the same happiness, but a different kind, a happiness tinged with sadness, but still happiness. He would live, not just for himself, but for Eleanor, for the woman who had taught him the meaning of love, loss, and the enduring power of companionship. The German shepherd and ginger cat beside him gave him strength, and the spirit of the old lady never left him.